Introducing Alex Barker. Now, I found Alex completely by accident, but I have been in love with Be More Pirate for approximately 5 years. I've got Colin Newlin to thank for that. And I'm so pleased he's in the audience. Lovely to have you with us today, Colin. And I found myself on a networking event. I don't do networking, guys, right? So this was really unusual for me. And I'm sitting there going, what am I doing here? I can't remember. And then Alex started speaking and she said she's a co-author of How to Be More Pirate. And I'm like, oh, that's why I'm here. Here we go. And then when we were put into a breakout room, Alex was in my breakout room. Thank you, universe. So I couldn't help but ask her if she would come and speak to us, because there is so much that she endorses and shares that we're like, yep, I agree. And I think it will resonate with you guys as well. So if you're a Collaboration Global member and you've never heard me speak of Be More Pirate, where have you been? But if you're not, if you're a guest here today, really enjoy this conversation that we're going to have with Alex, and we'll be discussing it afterwards. So we'll go into breakout rooms. So make notes if you want to, but hopefully you'll come away with this with something that you can go, do you know what? I'm going to do that in my business. It's perfect. So I'm going to hand over now. I'm going to stop my little share. Alex, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'll be interested to see what people make of this in relation to the being and the doing. So that perhaps can be part of the conversation in the breakout rooms. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen too. Here we go. Be More Pirate. There's so much I want to share about this today, but we've got 20 minutes, so I'm going to quite rapidly go through some of the key things I think are important. But I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about me as well. I'm going to start by sharing maybe what is my most pirate moment to date, aged 8 at my first pirate party, actually, dressed as a mermaid. I remember this moment really clearly because I was adamant I didn't want to go dressed as a boy to this party. And so my mum made me this really fabulous homemade mermaid costume so that I could go as a mermaid. In hindsight, I now realise that I am actually the most pirate person at the party, despite my different costume, because in a nutshell, Be More Pirate is about giving yourself permission to break some rules, to go your own way, and to have agency in a situation. And here I am giving myself permission to be more glamorous than everyone else. But to be honest, before I started Be More Pirate, in my adult life, I didn't really consider myself to be much of a rule breaker. In fact, I think I've always been quite good at following rules and ticking boxes. And I really, really thought that was the route to success. That was everything that I taught. And it's only been this incredible adventure over the last 3 years that's allowed me to realize that that's actually not the way that I want to go. When I first discovered Be More Pirate, the book, which is written by my co-pirate, Sam, published in 2018. When I first found this book, I actually didn't like it very much. Well, I judged the book by its cover. I took a look at it and thought, this looks like a really good marketing concept. It's all bright pink and black. And I thought that the subtitle, How to Take on the World and Win, was a bit clickbaity. So I thought, well, am I being sold a false promise here? And at that time in my life, I was at a point of real disillusionment and frustration with kind of institutions and leadership in general. And I thought there was a lot of people talking the talk, but not walking the walk, not really being willing to make some sacrifices, to make some big changes. And so when I found this, I thought, well, is this book just style over substance? It was only a few months later when I came across a job advertisement for a right-hand pirate. And I realized that this is the guy who'd written this book I didn't like. But I thought it sounded like an interesting job. So I went back and read the whole book the whole way through. And even though I still had some questions about it, I had never seen the idea of social change being presented in this way before. And so I went and interviewed for the job with Sam. And I asked him very directly, is this book, got some meat behind it? Are you serious about creating change? And he just held up his hands and said, I don't know, you tell me. All I know is I've got people writing to me from all over the world telling me about the rebellions that they're starting, the rules that they're breaking in their workplaces, they're quitting their jobs, and it seems to be that something in this book is allowing them, giving them that permission to do things differently. And I don't know what to do. And it was really Sam's like level of transparency and openness as a leader, and someone, you know, with some influence that I'd never seen before. So I immediately trusted him, and we set off on this adventure to figure out how to evolve the book into something bigger than just a book, how to make it into a kind of movement, a network, and a framework for other people to support them to make changes. And what an adventure that's been. I've learned to love the journey rather than obsess about the milestones along the way in the way that I used to do in my previous work. But we did hit one major milestone, which was to write a second book, which I kind of authored, which is to capture all the stories of the people who'd made changes as a result of Be More Pirates. You know, I wish, Jill, we'd met earlier and we could have, you could have maybe made it into the book, but these are the stories of ordinary people creating change using the pirate framework. And I knew that the only way it would grow if people could see people like themselves doing this stuff. So that was where the book came from. And when I was interviewing people for the book and trying to understand how you be more pirate, the line that stood out most to people in the book was this one: "No one is coming to save you." That is the line that got most repeated back to me. This moment of people realizing that a lot of the external stability that they'd relied upon for a long time was in fact quite fragile, and that really the only people they could rely upon was themselves. And in that moment, it seemed to shake people out of complacency and open the doors to real agency, but also it's obviously quite scary. And this line was also said by Sophie Walker, who is the founding leader of the Women's Equality Party. We interviewed her on our podcast last year, and she said the same thing: no one is coming to save you. That was her moment of realization. But what she said as an extension was, but it needs to go further than that. It doesn't stop there. You've got to then find the other people who share that same sense of frustration. And this is a really, really important part of what it means to be a pirate, and something I'm constantly reframing and unpacking. There is an element of rebellion to piracy, 100%, but it is 50% rebellion and 50% collaboration. You know, a pirate isn't just a rebel. And I think of rebels as kind of lone rangers. Pirates didn't exist outside of a crew setting. And we forget that in the myths about pirates. They were incredibly collaborative. They were dependent upon that in order to survive. And we'll come to that later. So, you know, that's another reason why Boris Johnson, as he might be a rule breaker, but he's not a pirate, I don't think. The other thing that was really, really important about the whole pirate, about why Be More Pirate was resonating with people, was the storytelling element. If you want to evolve a community or a network into a bigger movement, you need a story, you need a narrative to hook people into, to unite them. And Be More Pirate was doing that. It was a story that an ordinary person could step into and see themselves doing something quite extraordinary by breaking some rules. Unfortunately, we grow up with this idea of pirates, this stupid, cartoonish, roguish villains from Disney, where pirates are only out for themselves. They're kind of bloodthirsty, lying, thieving. But that's not the truth of it. The reality of piracy was probably a little bit more like this scene. And when I say piracy, I want to be clear, because I know we've got a global audience here. I'm talking about the golden age of piracy, which was a period of history in Britain from about 1700 to 1730, when a group of sailors took on the establishment, the British Empire, and kind of started this rebellion. And they were really ordinary sailors in the Navy. There were men and some women who'd become so frustrated with and unwilling to put up with really dire working conditions. You know, if you were a sailor, 40% of sailors would die on any voyage. It was horrific. And so they decided to set out, jump ship, form crews of their own, and live outside the law, which didn't make things easy necessarily. You can imagine the scene. You're a new pirate captain. You've gathered a crew, 80 odd illiterate sword-carrying strangers, And suddenly you have to figure out how you're going to work together. How are you going to harmonize the crew? But they had a blank slate to work with. They could reject a lot of the old rules of the establishment and create new ones instead. And the most significant and important thing about the pirate story is not what the rules that they broke, but the rules that they made instead. So number one was that they had real diversity for the first time. On a pirate ship, you would see female pirates. It's the only place you get this array of people working together in the Western world. There were, on the far right, you've got Anne Bonny, who was the most famous female pirate. Next to her is Black Caesar, originally an African tribal chief who was taken as a slave and then freed by pirates, one of the key members of Blackbeard's crew. So suddenly you've got real diversity, and it's mad that we're still talking about this in 2022. They gave everyone equal say. Pirate ships were the first place you saw real democracy. Everyone had an equal vote on decisions that were made, except in battle when the captain had the final say. They shared power. So they knew that power corrupts. They'd seen that in the Navy. You've got these really tyrannous pirate captains. And so what they did was they created a dual leadership system. And this is what we see in many governments around the world, particularly in the UK. You have the government and an opposition to hold the government to account. And so on a pirate ship, you had the captain and you had the quartermaster. The quartermaster was the representative voice of the crew and was in charge of things like the punishment and the money, the two things that were most likely to be abused by a captain. So it was really about holding power to account. They had equal and transparent pay, so everyone knew what everyone was getting. And this was a strategic move to prevent conflict. It's all about creating the best work culture that you could. So the captain and the quartermaster would typically get maybe two to 4 times more than the average crew member. You got more if you had more risk and responsibility, but otherwise it was flat and it was transparent. They also had social insurance. So if you lost a leg or an eye in battle, you would get compensation for your woes. You weren't just left for dead as you would have been in the Navy. So people felt for the first time that their lives were not expendable. Again, a way to create an inclusive, a harmonious crew. And finally, they even had same-sex marriage, unbelievably. They were so progressive, they created a ritual ceremony for same-sex relationships that was so sophisticated, it had an inheritance clause. So if your partner died, you'd get their share of whatever treasure you'd accumulated. And even outside the crew, you might imagine that pirates at least went and fought other pirate crews, but they didn't. In respect of our group here today, they were actually really collaborative amongst each other. So if there was a big battle to fight, they'd team up, and it was incredibly dynamic and networked. And this is, again, quite astonishing today that there are so many organizations out there who are trying to achieve similar goals and don't work together. We still live in an incredibly competitive environment and economy when pirates were showing the way for how to be collaborative. And the way that they differentiated between different crews was through the means of the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones. They were actually incredibly creative about the pirate branding. We always think of it as the skull and crossbones, there were lots of different types of flags. But really the purpose was to stop themselves getting into battle. So the whole tagline of the Jolly Roger, surrender or die, meant that most of the time other opposing ships would surrender. And that meant that pirates actually were probably the least violent people on the sea at the time. They were not trying to get into battle, despite their reputation. They were trying to preserve their resources. So, this was a really kind of clever way of weaponizing and dramatizing their reputation in order to kind of stay off the battlefield. However, I will say that when they were violent, they were really violent. I won't evade that small fact, but they were generally trying to avoid it. The point being that pirates were innovators. They weren't the troublemakers that we grow up thinking they are. And all these new rules that they created were captured in something called the Pirate Code. The code was the blueprint for their culture. It was a way to operationalize their values, what they stood for, and make them real. And this is a really important thing, because this is the work that I do with organizations, is helping them to create a pirate code that actually works. And I'd say that it's what created trust, transparency, and accountability amongst the crew. And the way I tend to do this is to help teams write new rules, but first of all, establish what their principles are, what do we stand for? What are we fighting for? Who are we? And then translate those things into day-to-day behaviors and practices, because it's got to be made real. And the thing where most organizations fall down is when the rhetoric that they're putting out into the world is not lived day to day. And that's when that's when you get mistrust, and that's when tension brews. And I see this all the time. So we're always trying to look at how we translate principles into behaviors and close the gap between intention and action. Here are a couple of codes that our crew have made. I get sent them all the time. The one on the left is from a company called Tradecraft, who are an amazing original pirates who pioneered fair trade in the UK in the 1980s. There's an arts agency on the left, on the right here, who've created their own code as well. And these are really just principles. These are the principles they stand for. And then we do the work of really digging into how are we living that in reality. So what I want to share now, just quickly, is some of the principles and the way that I translate them into behaviors, the principles of Be More Pirate, or how to be more pirate, that maybe you can use to take away from today. The first one is to be more comfortable being uncomfortable. This is another line in Be More Pirate, the one that resonated most with me, I think. But in reality, what that means is the practice of asking uncomfortable questions. And the reason that I highlight the practice in this, and the reason why is because in all the work that I've been doing on workplace culture and supporting groups to work better together, quite often what happens is they're not able to voice and express the points of tension. So much seems to get buried. The levels of dishonesty in team meetings are astonishing. And that's partly because we don't practice it. We don't know how to raise this stuff properly. The more you create a space to practice, the more you become more confident and more diplomatic. But unfortunately, what we see at the moment is the things that need to be talked about either get buried or they come out in a burst of frustration. And then all that creates is defensiveness. So this practice, although it might seem a bit counterintuitive, is really about creating good team culture. I think it's really important. It's almost the number one thing that comes up when we do this. The second point is to take that a bit further and go off the edges of the map. This is my favorite thing. That's where the pirates went, into the darkness, the unknown terrain, at the edges of what is familiar. And at the edges, there are two things. There is treasure and dragons, fear and opportunity. You can't really have one without the other. So you have to go exploring. Lots of teams come to us and say, we want to be more innovative. And I say, okay, then you've got to be prepared to go off the edges. And there's three questions I ask to guide people there. The first one is, what is at the edges of your map? What are the taboo subjects? What are the things that are getting swept underneath the rug? And you can get there through that practice of uncomfortable questions. The second one is, who is at the edges? Who are you not engaging with? Who's completely off your radar? Who could give you a completely new perspective on a problem? And then where is off the edges? Different environments have such an impact on our mindset. It can be, give you so much inspiration and creativity. And yet so often we get trapped in kind of going to the same places, doing the same stuff. So really pushing yourself to explore new environments. I want to share one quick story with you from our book, which makes all of these things much more real and tangible for you, I hope. It's a story from the charity Macmillan Cancer Care, really amazing charity. And yes, that is a sex shop in the background. I am going there today. It's really important. So this story began when Macmillan had, the London engagement team at Macmillan had created over the period of about 2 or 3 years, a cancer community. They'd really done a lot of work to engage with diverse communities across London to understand the experience of having cancer. One day, a young woman called Sarah came forward. She was only 28 and she was just recovering from Hodgkin's lymphoma. And she said to them, the one thing that I cannot get any information upon in my recovery is sex after cancer. She's like, there's loads of information about fertility, but there's no information about sex for pleasure, in terms of, your body gets dismantled in cancer and it needs rebuilding. And I'm a completely different person now. She said, not only Is there no information? But no one can even signpost me. It's a real blind spot. And so the very willing pirate team at Macmillan's said, okay, let's explore this, let's open that door. And they held a sex and cancer workshop inside a sex shop. And the reason this is a kind of edges of the map exercise is because, first of all, the person bringing the question to them was someone at the edges of their community. It was a young woman who, being a young person, isn't the norm for someone experiencing cancer. It was a taboo subject, you know, they're quite a traditional charity. It wasn't a comfortable thing to talk about. And they took people into a new environment to talk about it, because getting out of the clinical setting was so significant for opening people up. And they all said that it was an incredibly transformative experience. So this is a really great demonstration of what the edges of the map can open up. The final thing I want to share from our kind of code is the importance of small, bold actions. When I talk about, you know, having some principles and then making them into behaviors, when we first started asking the question of what new rules do you want to write for yourself, people would usually go too big or too vague. And I knew from everything that everyone was saying about their busy lives and their overwhelm that they weren't going to do those things. So I was asking the wrong question. And the question that we needed to ask instead was, what small, bold actions can you take in the next week that will begin to move the needle on your goal, on your bigger ambition or vision? And when I say small, bold actions, what I mean is small enough to be logistically easy to accomplish in a week or so. So it could be just something like sending an email. Bold, because it's got to put you a little bit outside of your comfort zone. It's got to be on that nervous, excited edge. And ideally, it would be something that's repeatable, something where, you know, you're flexing the muscle, because that's kind of how you build how to break a rule. So that's kind of the framework we use for small, bold actions. And one team that did this really, really well, as an example, because it's also better done if you can do it with other people. Rules are created and broken socially. A team in a big local government in the UK took this principle and decided that they were going to try and recreate some of the cultural norms in the organization. And starting with email, we all, you know, kind of find ourselves a bit frustrated with email. Sam always says to me that long email threads are where great ideas go to die. So they had to figure out a way for that not to happen anymore. And so what they did was, after a couple of meetings in the local cafe down the road, they decided they were going to do something a bit bold, but something that was easy. They created 4 new rules that changed the culture of email. So thinking before I email, can I have a conversation instead? So rehumanizing work a little bit. Taking protected time away from email to focus on the things that make the biggest difference. So giving yourself that deep work focus and not pretending that the emails are the work. Checking my tone, am I structuring it in a way I'd be pleased to receive? And if it's bad news, I won't deliver it by email. So again, like having a more compassionate approach to people. So it was bold, you know, they felt like they are quite obviously saying that the email culture at the moment is tyrannous. It was easy to do because they just put this on the end of their email signatures. And that, the genius of it was that it was repeated all the time. People saw this message coming back and forth every time you emailed. So it was a really internal rebellion. The most important thing I'd say about the small, bold actions to kind of finish off is in relation to what Jill was saying about being and doing, even if your small, bold action fails, it's not really about that. It's about who you become in the process of doing it. What we're really doing is testing out the feeling of taking a risk, flexing that rule-breaking muscle that we have and we don't exercise enough. So even if the outcome isn't what you hoped it would be, the next time it might be, and you'll get a little bit braver in the process of doing it. So I'd like to leave you with the question, maybe we can take this into the breakout rooms, which is, what small bold action could you take? Probably at the beginning of the new year, we've at least thought maybe about some of the goals or ambitions we might have for the next year, things we want to change. But rather than leave them as big, lofty things to do, what is something small and actionable you could do in the next 48 hours that will give you the sense of like small win or momentum that you need to go forward. Okay, thank you.
Wow, quick round of applause for Alex. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I absolutely love that.